When I was a kid, I grew up in rural Michigan, where there wasn't much to do. If you enjoyed staring at trees and fields in solitude, then it was the perfect place. I left as soon as I got a car and had enough money to move. I don't hate nature, but I'd rather live near a big city. My parents sold that property 5 years ago. It was a 3-acre plot with a pretty big house and a storage shed out back. I was 13 when this happened. My parents often left me home alone because they trusted me to be responsible at a young age. That weekend, I was playing Vice City on my PS2 in the living room when suddenly I heard a loud noise outside, somewhere in the yard. I immediately ran to every window to see if I could spot anything but saw nothing until I got to the window overlooking the storage shed. The door was wide open. I quickly grabbed the rifle from the closet and headed outside. I shouted, "Who's there?" but got no response. As I got closer to the door, I yelled again, warning that I had a gun, before looking inside. There was a lot of stuff in there, from a riding lawnmower to a 4-wheeler and other small lawn care items. Someone could have easily been hiding behind any of those things. Although I wasn't easily scared, I felt uneasy, so I closed the door to the shed and went back inside. I locked the door and sat by the window for what seemed like forever, keeping an eye on the shed, expecting the door to open again at any moment. That door was too heavy to just open by itself, so it was clear that someone had been there and opened it. Whether they were still inside or not, I wasn't sure. I decided to call my dad for advice. I went to the kitchen, picked up the landline, and called his cell, but he didn't answer, so I left a voicemail. Back then, you still had to leave voicemails because texting wasn't mainstream yet. After that, I returned to my spot by the window, but this time I put a TV show on in the background to make waiting less monotonous. I had nearly given up when I suddenly heard a creaking noise from upstairs. My heart started racing. I had to ask myself the big question. Was I just imagining things, or was someone actually there? I had a strong protective instinct, and even though I didn't love this place, I saw it as mine, my family's, and I needed to protect it. But this situation was beyond me. I grabbed the rifle again and quietly headed upstairs. I didn't call out because that would alert the potential intruder that I'd heard them. I reached the top of the stairs and turned on the hallway light. There were 5 closed doors in front of me, 4 leading to bedrooms and 1 to a bathroom. Each door had a decent-sized gap at the bottom that you could see through. The creaking noise I heard earlier came from the side of the house where my parents' bedroom was, so I knelt down and peered through the crack under the door. I saw 2 bare feet facing away from me. My stomach dropped. The reality of the situation hit me hard, and I realized I wasn't ready to confront, let alone shoot, someone. I quickly stood up and rushed downstairs, retreating to the bathroom to call my dad. He still didn't answer. I left another voicemail, then called again and again. But no luck. He must have left his phone somewhere. Finally, I called 911, like I should have done from the start, and whispered into the phone, describing exactly what was happening. They told me to stay in the bathroom and not make a sound. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, and then they got closer to the bathroom door, as if the intruder somehow knew I was in there. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and there was a brief pause before a deep voice said, "Hey kid, what's up?" I can still remember that voice, and those words so vividly. If I heard that voice today, I'd recognize it instantly. I was so terrified I almost started crying. Ignoring the dispatcher's advice, I shouted back, "I'm on the phone with the police right now, and I have a gun." I put the operator on speakerphone so they could hear. The man tried to open the door, but when he realized it was locked, I heard him walk away. His footsteps faded, followed by the sound of a door slamming shut. I was sure it was the back door. I finally let out a sigh of relief and continued waiting for the police. When they arrived, it felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. After thoroughly checking the house inside and out and confirming the intruder was gone, they asked if I could stay somewhere else for the night. I said yes, I could go to my uncle's house. We contacted him, and he came over to speak with the police before taking me home with him. The thing that haunts me the most is that it was my fault. I could have prevented the whole situation. I had left the door unlocked when I went to check the shed. That's when the guy must have slipped inside. Even with a rifle in my hands, I never felt safe. It was truly the most terrifying experience of my life. When I was 19, my parents went on a week-long anniversary trip. My sister had already moved out by then, so I was left alone at home. My parents' house was surrounded by dense woods with a dirt road leading out to the main road. That road was very quiet, and the houses in the area were spaced pretty far apart, creating a really isolated feel. In this small town, everyone knew each other. You would frequently see familiar faces at the gas station, the grocery store, or the bars. Something I only really started to realize once I began frequenting those places myself. This story begins one day while my parents were away. I was at a gas station filling up my car when a black Jeep Cherokee pulled up to the pump next to mine. A man with a goatee stepped out, greeted me, and began pumping gas. In this town, it wasn't unusual for strangers to say hello. After securing the nozzle into his tank, he walked over to my side of the pump and asked, "Excuse me, do you know how to get to the interstate from here?" I gave him directions as best as I could. Oddly enough, instead of using his phone like most people would, he pulled out a notepad and wrote down what I said. He thanked me and then asked if I was local. I replied, "Yeah, I grew up here." He mentioned that he was from out of town but didn't say exactly where. After that, he went back to his side of the pump and asked for my name. I said, "My name is Kate." He responded with, "What a lovely name," then got back into his car and drove off. I also got into my car and left, heading home. It was only a few minutes later when I reached the turn to my driveway. I slowed down, signaled, and turned in. It was then that I noticed the car behind me was the same black Jeep Cherokee. He drove past as I turned into my driveway, but the odd thing was, he went in the completely opposite direction from the one I had told him to go to reach the interstate. He didn't slow down or anything as he passed me, so I assumed he must have just forgotten the directions I gave him and went the wrong way. I went inside and continued with my day as usual. That evening, while getting ready to meet up with friends, I walked outside toward my car and heard footsteps nearby. Like I said, my house was surrounded by woods, and this was summertime. The sound could have been from any number of animals, so I didn't think much of it, and just got in my car and left. But when I returned home a few hours later and stepped out of my car, I heard a man's voice coming from somewhere in the woods, calling my name. "Kate." I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked around, then quickly rushed inside, slammed the door shut, and sat on the couch to catch my breath. Even though my neighbors knew my name, the houses were far apart, and there was no reason for anyone to call my name like that without identifying themselves. I decided to call my parents to tell them what had happened. They reassured me, saying it was probably just one of the neighbors and that they might come by the house. I didn't mention the incident at the gas station to them. The next day, Saturday, I stayed home most of the day, but that evening, as I was getting ready to go out again, I heard it once more. A voice from not far away called my name, "Kate." This time, I didn't hesitate. I ran back into the house and locked the door. I called 911 and texted my family. When the police arrived, they checked around the property with flashlights but found nothing. They told me to call again if it continued. But honestly, I didn't feel much better after they left. The next day, I stayed inside until I had to go to work. I was a server at a nearby restaurant, and that night I was working a late shift. I left the house during the day, still on edge, half expecting to hear that voice again. Thankfully, I didn't. Perhaps the sight of the police car had scared whoever it was off. After a long shift at work, I was ready to come home and crash. But just as I stepped onto the front porch, I heard footsteps again. This time, they didn't sound like they were coming from an animal. I froze for a moment, listening, and then I heard that familiar voice again. "Kate, don't call the cops on me again, cutie." I shouted back, "You need help, you're sick," and quickly went inside. I called the police again, and once more, they came out, searched the property, and found nothing. My parents suggested I stay at a friend's house for the night, and I couldn't agree more. They were coming home the next day, so after that, I'd feel safer staying at the house. My friend Alex invited me to stay over at her place, so I packed a bag and was ready to go. I checked the windows first to make sure everything was secure. I hurried out to the car, locking the door behind me as fast as I could. As I slid the key into the ignition, I heard something to my left. There, right outside the driver's side door, was a man wearing a face mask, trying to open the door. I was too shocked to even scream. It felt like I couldn't breathe as I immediately put the car in drive. He began pounding on the window with his elbow. I sped off, looping around the yard before driving down the driveway and not stopping until I reached Alex's house. I was sobbing the entire drive there while keeping Alex and her dad on the phone. Her dad said he would have come to pick me up if he had known what was going on. One night, I was home alone, though I can't remember why exactly. All I recall is that my entire family was out. At that time, I was about 15 or 16 years old. I was really into gaming, and StarCraft was my favorite game. Honestly, I'd sometimes spend whole weekend nights playing StarCraft or other PC games. This was just before the COVID lockdown began. I was in my bedroom on the first floor, playing StarCraft on my computer when the doorbell rang twice. I rushed to the door because I didn't want to be away from my game too long and risk losing. When I reached the door, I asked, "Who is it?" Just like I always did when I was home alone. A soft and weak voice responded from the other side, but I couldn't hear it clearly. It sounded like a woman. I opened the door, leaving the storm door between me and this older woman, standing outside with a big smile on her face. She had her hands behind her back. I asked through the door, "Can I help you?" She said she needed to use a phone and asked if she could come inside. Growing up, I was always taught never to let a stranger into the house, even if it was a woman. But this situation made me feel awkward. I didn't know how to turn her away. I directed her to the library a few blocks down, as surely they would have a phone. Deep down, I knew the library was closed at that time, but I just wanted this stranger who was trying to get into my house to leave. She kept smiling, but what she said next didn't match her smile. She said, "It's rude to turn away an old lady asking for help." I responded the only way I could think of. "My parents don't allow strangers in the house. It's a rule." Slowly, I began closing the door, apologizing. She just stood there, not moving, still smiling at me. And although her smile didn't change, it suddenly felt a lot more sinister. I was heading back to my room when the doorbell rang again. There was no way I was opening that door again. From the start, that woman gave off weird vibes. Maybe something was wrong with her. Maybe she wasn't all there. These were things I had no way of knowing, and maybe it was selfish of me to send her away. But I wasn't opening the door for anyone while I was home alone. I went back to my game. Not too long after I sat back down, I heard tapping on the window. It was a clinking sound, like metal against glass. The window was right in front of my desk. I had the blinds pulled down, so I couldn't see what was making the noise, but I had a bad feeling. My room was the only one in the house with the light on. The terrible thought that it was that same woman and that she had walked over to my window terrified me. I turned off the sound on my computer. At that point, I no longer cared about the game. The clinking sound on the window persisted. I basically said, "Screw this," and left for a different room in the house. I sat in the dark living room for a bit, but then the doorbell rang again. This woman was harassing me now. I tried to convince myself she wasn't a threat, just some crazy old woman who didn't know where she was. When she rang the doorbell a second and third time, I decided to open the door and ask if there was someone I could call for her. But when I opened the door, this time there was a man standing on the other side. He looked about 10 years younger than her. He spoke through the storm door. "Have you seen my mother?" I answered, saying yes. She came to my door earlier. He then apologized and explained that his mother had dementia and wandered out of the house. I suddenly felt guilty, but then he asked if he could come inside for a moment, and once again, I felt uneasy. Why did he need to come inside? I told him the same thing I told the woman, who he claimed was his mother. I said we could just talk through the door. Then I told him that I thought she might have gone into my backyard, because I heard something by my window. I told him he could go around back and check. He thanked me and walked down the path, and I assumed he went into the backyard. But when I checked out back through the window, expecting to see him looking around, I saw no one, neither him nor his mother. It was all just too strange for me. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual, trying to fall asleep with the TV on in the background. But then I heard that familiar clinking sound on the window again. Something metallic was tapping against the glass. I remembered the concerned man and decided to try and help. I went to the window, lifted the blinds with my hand, and saw that same woman outside my window with that creepy smile. She was tapping a kitchen knife against the glass. I dropped the blinds and crawled back into bed. This didn't feel real. A short while later, the doorbell rang 4 times in quick succession. The clinking on the window had stopped by then. This was all too suspicious. It felt like some kind of robbery attempt. I ignored the doorbell. I stayed in bed, deciding to wait this out. At that time, I didn't have a cell phone. Growing up, I wasn't the most social person. For some reason, I didn't want to call the police either. I waited until it finally stopped. The next morning, I called my dad and told him what happened. He told me I was smart not to open the door. Everyone agreed that everything about it sounded like an attempted robbery. Could that woman have really had dementia, and was that man really her concerned son? Maybe, but everything felt too coordinated. Why did he want to come inside? How did he know she came to my house specifically? Why didn't he go into the backyard to look for her when I told him he could? There were too many unanswered questions that led me to believe I avoided something terrible by not opening that door. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, about a week ago, something happened to me personally that inspired me to revisit this theme. My friend Cody asked me to watch his dog, Theo, for the night. Theo is a little pomsky, and he barks a lot. So when he started barking like crazy at something outside, I didn't think much of it, except to tell him to be quiet a few times. But when he went to the back door and kept barking, I figured he wanted to go out, so I headed to the door to let him out. But as I got close, I realized someone was trying to open the door from the outside. And then, through the screen, I saw another man looking right back at me. This man was in the backyard, which was alarming enough, and he wasn't anyone I recognized as being part of Cody's family. I asked him who he was, and he responded by asking if I had seen Melissa. Melissa is Cody's younger sister, who's in her 20s. Meanwhile, this guy looked like he was in his mid-50s and homeless. I told him he needed to leave. There was no Melissa living here. He asked, "Are you sure?" I responded, "Yeah, you need to leave. There are cameras all over the property." He left right after that. Getting him to leave was easy, but when Cody asked his sister about the man, she said she had no idea who he could be. The man looked like he was 55, drunk, and filthy. Not exactly someone Cody's 20-something-year-old sister would know. The fact that he went to the back door and tried to let himself in was terrifying, because you could only imagine what he was trying to do to Melissa. And that's why so many of these stories could be avoided, by simply keeping your doors locked. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. I've always hated being home alone. My name is Peter and I'm 13 years old. My little sister Sam is 10. Last Tuesday, we had to stay home because we were both sick. Mom had to go to work, and our stepdad, Steve, promised to check on us later. It was a rainy, cold day, which made us feel even worse. Sam and I were lying on the couch in the living room, wrapped in blankets and watching cartoons. Our dog, Max, was curled up at our feet, snoring softly. The house was quiet, except for the TV. Mom had left us some soup and crackers in the kitchen. Even when she's not home, she always makes sure we're taken care of. Around noon, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't just because I was sick. I had this strange sensation that someone was watching us. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, the sound of the front door opening. I turned to Sam, who was staring at me with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We both knew it couldn't be Steve. He always called before coming home early. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed Mom's number. She picked up on the second ring. "Mom, is Steve supposed to be home?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, honey, he's still at work." "Why?" she replied, sounding concerned. A chill ran down my spine. "I think someone's in the house," I said, my voice trembling. "Lock yourselves in the basement. I'll call Steve and the police," Mom said urgently. I grabbed Sam's hand and we ran straight to the basement door. Max began barking loudly, his barks echoing throughout the house. We rushed down the stairs and locked the door behind us. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old boxes and forgotten toys. We found a corner behind some of the boxes and huddled together, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Max's barking grew louder, and we could hear footsteps moving around upstairs. The steps were slow and deliberate, like someone searching for something. I held Sam close, trying to comfort her, though I was just as scared as she was. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear Sam's quick, shallow breaths. It felt like hours passed as we sat there in the dark basement. The footsteps continued, occasionally pausing, and they seemed to be getting closer. I kept glancing at my phone, desperately waiting for any sign of help. Finally, we heard the front door open again, followed by Steve's voice calling out for us. Relief washed over me. We stayed hidden until we heard him call our names. "Peter, it's Steve. Where are you?" I unlocked the basement door and peeked out. Steve was standing in the hallway, looking around. His face was pale, and he was holding a baseball bat. We ran to him and hugged him tightly. "It's okay, kids, the police are on their way," he said, trying to reassure us. "Stay behind me." We followed him as he cautiously checked each room in the house. Max was still barking, standing at the entrance to the basement. Steve slowly opened the basement door and called out, "Is anyone down there?" No response. He started down the stairs, and we followed at a safe distance. The basement was just as we had left it, dark and cluttered. Steve moved slowly, checking behind the boxes and old furniture. Suddenly, Max started growling, his fur bristling. Steve pointed the bat toward the far corner of the basement. There, crouched behind a pile of boxes, was a man. He was thin, wearing dirty clothes, with wild, frightened eyes. He looked terrified, but so were we. "Stay right there. The police are coming," Steve shouted firmly. The man didn't move. He just stared at us, his eyes wide with desperation. We backed away, and within minutes, we heard the sound of police sirens outside. Officers rushed into the house and quickly took the man into custody. He didn't resist, just allowed them to handcuff him and lead him away. The police thoroughly searched the basement but didn't find anything else. They asked us what had happened, and we told them everything. Steve stayed with us the entire time, making sure we were safe. After the police left, Mom came home and hugged us both tightly. "You did the right thing by calling me in hiding," she said, tears in her eyes. We never found out what that man wanted or why he was in our house. The police said he was likely a drifter, someone looking for a place to hide or maybe steal something. But not knowing for sure only made the whole experience even scarier. Last Friday night was supposed to be just another regular evening. My parents had a dinner party to attend, so they hired a babysitter to take care of me. Her name was Sophia, a teenager who lived just down the street. I really liked Sophia because she was super friendly and always brought fun games and snacks. That night, we had planned to watch a movie and eat popcorn. My parents left around 7 p.m. They reminded Sophia about the emergency numbers and kissed me goodbye before walking out the door. The house felt quiet after they left. Sophia and I settled into the living room, where she put on my favorite cartoon. About an hour later, there was a knock on the door. I got excited, thinking maybe my parents had come back to get something or brought me a surprise. Sophia told me to stay on the couch while she went to check who was at the door. I heard her ask, "Who is it?" "Pizza delivery from Tony's Pizza," a deep voice answered from outside. I was confused. We hadn't ordered any pizza. Sophia cracked the door open slightly and peeked outside. Two men stood on the porch, both wearing baseball caps pulled low over their eyes. One of them was holding a large pizza box. Sophia frowned. I think you've got the wrong house. We didn't order any pizza. The man holding the pizza box insisted, This is the address we were given. Someone must have called. Sophia hesitated. I could see she was starting to get nervous. She didn't open the door any wider. What name is on the order? She asked. The two men looked at each other and then back at Sophia. We don't have a name, just the address. That didn't make any sense. Sophia's face grew tense. I'm gonna call the pizza place to check. Hold on a moment. She shut the door quickly and locked it. I watched as she grabbed her phone and pretended to dial. She spoke loudly. Hi, Tony's Pizza? I want to confirm an order at 123 Maple Street. She paused for a moment and glanced at me with wide, worried eyes. I knew she wasn't really talking to anyone. She was just pretending. The men outside must have figured this out too. They started arguing, saying things like, We need to drop off this pizza, and just open the door. Their voices were growing louder and angrier. My heart started pounding. Something wasn't right. Sophia raised her phone and said loudly, If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police. She pressed a few buttons, making it look like she was serious. The cops are on their way. Suddenly, the men went silent. There was a tense moment before I heard their footsteps retreating from the door. Sophia waited a few seconds, then peeked through the window. She watched as they got into a van and drove off. Sophia quickly locked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Then she sat down next to me. I could see she was trying to stay calm, but her hands were still shaking. It's okay now, she said softly. They're gone. I nodded, but I was still scared. Who were they? I asked. Sophia shook her head. I don't know, but they definitely weren't pizza delivery guys. They were trying to trick us. We decided to stay in the living room with all the lights on. Sophia called my parents to tell them what had happened. They were really worried and said they'd come home right away. Sophia also called the real Tony's Pizza to check if there had been any orders placed from our address. They confirmed there hadn't been. While we waited for my parents, Sophia and I tried to distract ourselves by playing games on her phone, but every little noise made us jump. We kept glancing at the door, half expecting those men to come back. When my parents finally got home, they hugged me tight and thanked Sophia for being so brave and smart. My dad called the police to report the incident. The police came and asked us a lot of questions. They said we did the right thing by not opening the door and pretending to call for help. That night, I slept in my parents' room. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if Sophia hadn't been so cautious. The next day, my parents installed a new security system with cameras. They wanted to make sure we were always safe. Sophia was a real hero that night. She kept me safe and calm, even though she was scared herself. I learned that it's important to be cautious and trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And sometimes the best thing you can do is pretend to be brave until help arrives. After that night, I became more aware of the dangers around us, but I also knew that with people like Sophia looking out for me, I was in good hands. We never found out who those men were or what they wanted, but thankfully, they never came back. Living in a downtown loft near bars can be exciting, but it also has its frightening moments. Most nights, I would hear loud music and people either laughing or arguing as they left the bars. Sometimes I feared that drunk strangers might accidentally wander into my place. My loft was on the ground floor, and while the building was secure, the constant noise still left me feeling uneasy. One Friday night, I was home alone. It was a typical evening with the usual noise filtering in from the street. After a long, exhausting day, I decided to turn in early. I got into bed, hoping for a restful night's sleep. But around midnight, I was startled awake by something strange. I heard eerie voices and the faint sound of a violin coming from my living room. My heart started pounding. I lay still, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream or noise from outside. But the sounds persisted, growing louder and more unsettling. I could hear whispers, as if people were conversing in a language I couldn't understand. The violin played a haunting melody that sent chills down my spine. Overcome with fear, I decided to hide. I quietly slipped out of bed and tiptoed to my closet. Closing the door behind me, I sat in the darkness, my heart racing. I held my breath, straining to hear any clues as to what was happening. The voices and music echoed through the loft, making it seem like there were intruders inside. After what felt like an eternity, the noises suddenly stopped. The abrupt silence was almost more terrifying than the sounds themselves. I waited a few more minutes, unsure if it was safe to come out. Finally, I gathered my courage and slowly opened the closet door. I tiptoed toward the living room, my hands trembling. When I reached the living room, it was completely empty. There were no signs of anyone having been there. I checked the front door, and it was still locked. I was baffled and scared. What could have caused those noises? As I stood in the middle of the living room, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a faint clicking sound from my sound system. I walked over and saw that its light was on. This was strange because I hadn't used it that evening. I turned it off and then back on, hoping it was just a glitch. Then I heard a knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could be visiting at this hour? I cautiously approached the door and looked through the peephole. To my surprise, it was Mark, my neighbor from the loft next door. He looked concerned and a bit embarrassed. I cracked open the door, still on edge. "Hey, Mark, is everything okay?" I asked. "Hey, sorry to bother you," Mark said, scratching his head sheepishly. "I think I might have accidentally connected to your sound system." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Mark explained. "I'm working on a horror film for a project. I got this new wireless speaker system, and it seems like it connected to your speakers instead of mine. I've been playing sound effects and music for hours, and I didn't realize they were coming through your speakers." Relief washed over me as I realized there were no intruders, just a technical mishap. I laughed, though my hands were still shaking. "That explains a lot," I said. "I thought I was losing my mind or that someone had broken in." Mark apologized again and promised to fix his system so it wouldn't happen again. We chatted for a bit and he shared stories about his film project. He was working on a scene involving eerie voices and haunting violin music, which explained the terrifying sounds I had heard. After Mark left, I made myself a cup of tea to calm my nerves. I couldn't believe how scared I had gotten, hiding in my closet over a simple connection issue. As I sipped my tea, I looked around my cozy loft and felt grateful. Living downtown had its challenges, but it also brought unexpected moments of connection and understanding with my neighbors. When I was a teenager living with my parents, there was one time I had to stay home alone for an entire week. This was quite rare because my parents didn't go out much. A wealthy friend of my mom, named Patty, invited my parents on a trip and she covered all the expenses. I was an only child, so I was left alone at home. Our house was located in Newark, Ohio, in Licking County. Yes, our county was actually called Licking. My parents' old house had woods in the backyard and was on a quiet road where only a few cars would pass by each day. We had a large deck in the backyard that overlooked the woods, along with a spacious yard. We even had a small fish pond and an above-ground swimming pool. That Thursday night, I remember it clearly because I had talked to my friends earlier about our weekend plans. It was July 2013. I was out on the deck, smoking weed and listening to music through my speaker. That's when things started happening. I thought I heard a voice coming from the woods. I turned the music down and listened for a bit. There was no repeating sound, so I turned the music back up. But when the music started playing loudly again, I heard the voice from the woods once more. This time, I turned the music off completely and listened longer. A voice echoed from the woods, confirming I wasn't imagining things. It was a man's voice saying, "Hey, over here." The voice wasn't too far away, but it wasn't that close either. The woods were about 20 to 30 yards from the deck, and the voice seemed to be coming from there. I didn't think the voice was calling out to me. It could have been some kids playing a game. But then the voice called out again, "Hey, over here, we need help." This time I realized the voice was too deep to belong to a kid, and when someone says we need help, that's usually concerning. I started to feel uneasy, wondering if these calls were meant for me. Then the voice got louder. "Straight in front of you, please help us." The voice was coming from directly in front of me in the woods. At this point, I started to feel like this was indeed directed at me. Reluctantly, I called out, "Who's there?" And they responded, "We just need help. We're stuck in the woods." I called back, "What do you mean by that?" The voice replied, "Just help us. We're right in front of you." I got up from my chair, walked down the deck stairs, and started heading towards the woods. I called out, "I'm coming. Where are you?" The voice replied instantly, "Right in front of you. I see you." I asked, "Wait, are you alone or is someone with you?" This time there was no response. I stopped halfway towards the woods. A bad feeling settled in my gut about the situation. I started walking backward, retreating towards the house and the deck. I didn't want to turn my back on the woods because it dawned on me that something about this situation was very suspicious. I made it back to the deck, and the voice didn't call out again. If they could really see me and this was real, they would have said something like, "Where are you going?" But instead, there was silence, as if they knew I was catching on to something. Who knows how many people could have been out there? Maybe just one, or maybe three. All I knew was that getting stuck in the woods didn't make any sense, especially if they could see me. Like, what? Did they get their shirt caught on a branch? I went inside the house and locked all the doors for safety. I sat in the living room for a while, still high, and I think that's why I was more trusting at first, because I was relaxed. But then I heard the voice again, closer this time, definitely in the backyard, not in the woods anymore. I heard water splashing. It could have been from the pool or the fish pond. I hurried to the window to check. At first I didn't see anyone, but then I heard the voice again. "I see you," followed by a laugh. I saw a man, at least one person, clearly visible. He was hiding behind the pool on the far side, and I could only see his head. It was too dark to make out any details besides his dark, medium-length hair. I closed the blinds and tried to ignore him. Maybe he would lose interest if he saw I wasn't responding. He was probably a sick, twisted person who enjoyed messing with others, so I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. But when he began banging aggressively on the window where I had just closed the blinds, screaming, "Help!" I couldn't take it anymore. I shouted at the top of my lungs, "Get the hell away, you freak! The cops are coming!" I kept screaming it over and over, trying to sound crazier than he was. I heard him start laughing on the other side of the glass, but his laughter faded as I assumed he walked away. I sat back down on the couch, trembling and out of breath. I stayed there for a while, and it seemed like he had really given up. That night, I still managed to sleep well because weed always helps me sleep. But I wondered if I would have handled the situation differently if I hadn't been high. This experience made me more cautious about who I opened my door to in the future. When I was 24 and still living with my parents, there was a time when they were both out, leaving me home alone. It was a pretty normal day until I went outside to play basketball in the front yard. While playing, I glanced up at one of the upstairs windows and, to my surprise, saw a woman standing there. She wasn't my mom, nor my sister. She was a stranger, someone I had never seen before. As soon as she realized I spotted her, she quickly moved away from the window. I rushed inside and headed upstairs to check the living room, but she wasn't there. I went from room to room, bedrooms, bathrooms, and closets, but found nothing. Then I went downstairs to check the living room, kitchen, dining room, another bedroom, and more closets. Finally, I decided to check the basement, though I doubted she would be down there. The basement was small, with a couple of couches, a bar, and 2 closets. There weren't many places for someone to hide, but when I opened the second closet door, I felt a real sense of fear because this was the last spot where she could be hiding. I yanked open the door as if ripping off a Band-Aid, and like the previous closets, I quickly stepped in, just in case she was hiding there, and I needed the upper hand. But all I met was a pile of coats and hangers. I was completely baffled. I wasn't going to question my sanity, because I was certain I saw her. This wasn't something you'd just vividly imagine. After searching the entire house, I returned to the middle floor and yelled at the top of my lungs that whoever was in the house needed to get out immediately. I shouted so loud that my neighbor from next door came over to ask if I was okay. I told him I had just seen a strange woman at the upstairs window staring at me while I played basketball. He came inside to help me search again, but we still couldn't find her. Eventually, we assumed she must have snuck out through the back door, which I had left unlocked earlier when I went to grab the basketball. After my neighbor left, I locked all the doors, called my parents, and told them the bizarre story. They weren't exactly pleased, but asked me to check if anything had been stolen. Luckily, after thoroughly checking, everything valuable seemed to be in place. That night, I was still pretty shaken up, so I checked the house one more time before going to bed just to feel a bit more at ease. But it wasn't easy to fall asleep. My mind kept racing, which is understandable considering the situation. Not everyone can relate to seeing a stranger inside their house from a window. However, my uneasiness ended up working in my favor, and here's why. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard some strange noises from the other side of the room. I had the ceiling fan on, so the room wasn't completely silent, and at first I didn't turn around right away. But the sound was distinctly human-like. I turned to the other side and immediately saw her. She was crawling out from under my bed. She stood up tall next to the bed, and I screamed even louder than before. I jumped out of bed, tackled her to the floor, and grabbed her by the throat, demanding to know who she was. Just then, the doorbell rang. It was my neighbor again. I picked the tall, dirty-looking woman off the floor and dragged her to the front door with me as she thrashed and clawed at me. I still have 2 scars on my right arm from her nails. I opened the front door, and my neighbor stepped inside to help me restrain her. That's when I called the police. The entire time we waited for the police to arrive, she screamed and cursed at both of us, even threatening us. The best way to describe her would be as a meth addict going through withdrawal. When the police finally arrived, one of the officers immediately recognized her. They had dealt with her multiple times before. Ironically, her name was Karen. It was incredibly satisfying to watch her get loaded into the back of the police car. I thanked my neighbor for coming over so quickly to help, and although my mind was still racing that night, I felt an odd sense of satisfaction. I can't fully explain it, but instead of being completely terrified, which I still was to some extent, I also felt an overwhelming sense of relief.